Grace and peace. Welcome to the table. My name is Brett. I'm the pastor here, and it's really great to be with you. Really, really great. So we are in week 2 in our series titled Stretch Thin, What to Do When Life Pushes You to the Limit. And this has been, just a season where many of us have felt stretched too thin, in the wise words of Bilbo Baggins. And right here, I've already lost everyone under the age of 30. Maybe mid-20s, maybe some of you upper 20s know Bilbo Baggins, maybe. But he said this, he said, "I feel thin, sort of stretched like butter scraped over too much bread." And I love that imagery. And I'd say that about sums up our year so far. You know, if our life energy is the butter, this year has been too much sourdough. And the butter has run out, and yet that knife just keeps on scraping. And so what we want to do in this series is just to look again to the God we've come to know in Jesus, for some resources, for some wisdom, for some insight, to help us thrive in this season. And in the first few weeks of this series, we'll be in many kind of different passages all over the Bible. As we go a little bit farther into it, we'll kind of start to intersect with Advent and some of the stories around the birth of Christ and things. So last week, just to recap, last week, if you weren't here, we kicked off the series and we discussed our brain's negativity bias and how we need to begin living in a sense of awareness of ourselves, awareness of the world around us, of God, to start to kind of increase our faith and our sense of connection to God. And so the way we kind of summed it up last week was with the phrase, "To worry is human, to find peace divine." So that was last week. If you missed it, you can find that on our podcast. Next week, we'll be looking at the mysterious power of our words, of speech, and the way they just direct our lives in so many ways. So that'll be next week. But for tonight, the title of my message is All Alone. And I don't think it will come as some sort of huge shock to hear that we are living through not just a pandemic, but really an epidemic of loneliness in the United States. This was true even prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. But if we had any doubt, then I suspect the last 9 months have pretty much put that to rest. And I know just from the occasional coffee connections I'm having with some of you, to the many text conversations and the occasional phone calls, I know, that loneliness, that sense of isolation, that has been a real struggle for many folks in our community. And so the way I want to kind of define loneliness tonight, it's one of those things that, we all know, but sometimes maybe we lack words. So let me give you a few words for tonight. Loneliness is that it's a gap between the sense of connectedness that I have and what I need. A gap between the sense of connectedness I have and what I need. I listened to a podcast conversation between Vivek Murthy and Brene Brown on this topic. A huge thank you to Karen Miner. She sent it my way. And I found it really insightful. But one of the things they named is that, offering a definition of loneliness doesn't quite get at the feeling, the experience of loneliness. And in fact, for that, really only metaphors and word pictures will do. So I want to share a few with you. I recall an article I read, this was, probably years ago, about the experience of homelessness. And this kind of came from someone who lived outside for a long period of time. And later they reflected on the experience. And what they said the hardest part was that as a homeless person, they sort of faded into the background of the city. Almost like, how when you're walking through a city, there's a lot of objects and there's a lot of things. So you have like concrete sidewalk here, parking meter there, and then someone who lives outside, over there. But they're all they're all just kind of objects, just part of the city, landscape, so to speak. And this person, they said, once I took on the look, the vibe, the smell, of homelessness, I effectively became invisible. That was their word. I became invisible. Isn't that loneliness? Invisibility. When we are lonely, we feel so invisible. There's a beautiful passage in Galatians chapter 6, verse 2, where the Apostle Paul, he's writing a letter to a small church just like ours. And actually, sorry, it's verse 14, Galatians 6:14. He says this, bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. Isn't that wonderful? To have a sense of connectedness, a sense of community, a sense that there are people who will help me, help you bear the emotional burdens of life, to have people there that I can turn to when things get just too heavy, people I can open up and share with, and through my words, I can, as this verse kind of names, I can transfer a little of my burden to them, and then they, in love, and love's the word, right? That's the law of Christ. That's what it means, the law of love. They, in love, they absorb a little of that burden into their very bodies. Bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. And I feel in that moment, have you ever experienced that? You know what it is to kind of feel emotionally unburdened. Isn't that wonderful? What a grace. But of course, the reverse is also true. What pain to have a heavy emotional burden and yet have no one to turn to. That's another picture of loneliness. It's like having a burden that I must carry alone. And yet we might say that what is strange about the tree of loneliness is that while its roots go deep in us, its visible leaves, which we might call its symptoms, can often manifest in just a variety of different ways, such that this is what's so strange. We can be lonely and not even realize we are lonely because we're looking at the leaves, so to speak. We're looking at the symptoms and not the roots. For example, when we lash out in anger, it can actually be loneliness that's driving us towards that. When we withdraw from others, it can actually be rooted, quite strangely enough, in loneliness. Like you'd think, no, we would never isolate when we're lonely. That's not at all the case. We often kind of pull away, not realizing why we're pulling away, but it's because we're lonely. When we turn to substances that numb, food that comforts, one night stands that others, may look at and just think like, well, that's just nothing more than, worldly sexual lust or something. And yet they just might be desperate attempts to stave off the choking loneliness that we feel. In that interview, where Brene Brown was interviewing Vivek Murthy, she told a story. I think she heard this from another psychiatrist, where they were in charge of overseeing the mental health of troops in the U.S. military. And so they were kind of meeting with various soldiers, and she was, asking like, how are you doing? And what they kept saying was, I'm tired. I'm tired. Like, how are you? I'm tired. I'm tired. Just kept this word, I'm tired. I'm tired. And she couldn't quite figure out like what's underneath this, or what's going on here. I mean, they're getting the sleep they need. But as she began to ask questions and go a little deeper, she realized they're lonely. They're lonely. right? Because all of a sudden their life had changed, like they're living on either on a base or maybe even deployed and away from family, and they were lonely, but it was manifesting as fatigue. And so they're saying, I'm tired, I'm tired, I'm tired. But that's what happens, right? With the tree of loneliness, its roots can actually be, it can kind of be quite different, right? Where we don't realize it's loneliness that we're experiencing. In other words, you might say, loneliness isn't necessarily the somewhat stereotypical thing we imagine. For example, if you imagine a lonely person, you might envision someone maybe at a party, sitting in the corner, hoodie pulled over their foreheads, talking to no one, and you look at them, you say, "Oh, they're so lonely." But of course, it's rare for social isolation to be that obvious. In fact, this is what's fascinating. A study by Cigna Insurance from January of this year found that more than 3 in 5 Americans, that's 60% of the population, reported feeling, here's the list, lonely, left out, poorly understood, and lacking companionship. And I mentioned the date on this study because it's important to note that was before the pandemic. Isn't that remarkable? 60% of people, US adults, before we, for the sake of saving lives, began to intentionally distance ourselves. And so, 60%, that is to say, think about it, the majority of people you and I interact with each day, the majority, even possibly, of folks listening to me right now, are lonely. It's an epidemic. It's a huge, huge problem. Which is why it seems not insignificant that so much of the Bible concerns itself with what? With relationship, with connection, with the brokenness of humanity, with the ways that we become invisible to one another, with the ways that we can fail to bear one another's burdens, that we can fail to see one another, fail to love one another. But then in Jesus Christ, God among us, God with us, God slips into skin, and like the great artist he is, what does he do? He begins to restore the image of God in each of us, and we find our sense of identity and value in him. And what happens? We are then empowered to connect with others at whole new levels, which is why there are so many statements in the New Testament known as the one another's. If you grew up in church, these are probably familiar to you. But if you didn't, that's perfectly okay, because honestly, you're not far behind. These are statements you can learn in a moment. This is like super, super simple stuff, at least on our surface, and you just try to live them, and find they are anything but easy. They're really kind of anything but ordinary in our culture. And in many ways, I think they are the way that the Spirit of God empowers us as the church to begin to break the chains of loneliness in our own lives and in our communities. This is just a sample of them from the New Testament. Love one another. Be devoted to one another. Honor one another above yourselves. Live in harmony with one another. Build up one another. Be like-minded towards one another. Accept one another. Admonish one another. Greet one another. Care for one another. Serve one another. Bear one another's burdens. Forgive one another. Be patient with one another. Speak the truth in love. Be kind and compassionate to one another. Speak to one another with psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. Submit to one another. Consider others better than yourselves. Look to the interests of one another. Bear with one another. Teach one another. Comfort one another, encourage one another, exhort one another, stir up one another to love and good works, show hospitality to one another, employ the gifts that God has given us for the benefit of one another, clothe yourselves with humility towards one another, pray for one another, confess your faults to one another. That's a long list. I'm really glad I've been running because I might have lost my wind. Those are beautiful. I love that last one, that confess your faults to one another, because in many ways that brings us right to the doorstep of a wonderful insight from a theologian and Christian martyr, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, that I found a few weeks back. He writes this. He says, it may be that Christians, right? So he's talking about the church here, notwithstanding, which means kind of in spite of all of our corporate worship, common prayer, all of their fellowship and service, as we serve one another, that we may still be left, or that they may still be left to their loneliness, Bonhoeffer says. The final breakthrough to fellowship does not occur because though they have fellowship with one another as believers and devout people, they do not have fellowship as the undevout, as sinners. The pious fellowship, he continues, permits no one to be a sinner. So everyone must conceal his sin from himself and from the fellowship. Isn't that interesting? From himself or herself and from the broader community. So we remain alone with our sin, living in lies and hypocrisy. It's a heavy quote, but I think what it names so powerfully is that it's not enough to simply be around other people. Right? This is kind of the simple mistake that we often make when we're lonely. We think to ourselves, I just need to be around some people. Just get me around some people. And there's, of course, a grain of truth in that. We do need, of course, fellowship, connection with others. Tough to break out of loneliness if you're totally isolated. so there's truth in that. But here's the key, and this is what I think we get from Bonhoeffer's line and from that final one another, that if we are not there in that community, in that moment of connection, if we are not there as our true selves, if we are trying to pretend to be someone different than we actually are, if we feel the need to perform, to earn love and approval, if we are not honest and vulnerable, then frankly, we can be around people all day long and yet still feel lonely. In other words, where there is no vulnerability, there is no true community. Where there is no vulnerability, there is no true community. But of course, the beautiful thing is that when we move in the opposite spirit of that, what happens? When we are brave and vulnerable, then we experience the love of God and a deep sense of connection to others. I want to invite my friend Adam Thompson on with us. Adam is a member here at the table, and he's definitely dealt just really profoundly with kind of everything we're discussing tonight. And one of the things I so appreciate about Adam is his vulnerability and honesty and sensitivity. He's just wonderful. And so he's taught me so much about that. So Adam, welcome, my friend. I'm so glad to be on. So you found, the table pretty early on after our launch about a year ago or so. So could you kind of start by just describing, tell us a little bit of the story, like, your life before coming to the table, and what was your mindset, your emotional state, like kind of, your headspace, like where were you?
I was before the table. I was just very anxious, and I wanted to be left alone and not be around people. I was just one of those people who just wanted to keep to myself and just be shut in and not like deal with anyone, and my anxious brains just left me so lonely, and no one did felt like I had no one to turn to really.
Hmm. Yeah. So it was you were spending a lot of time um, in your house, alone. That was a lot of your kind of life. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about. So you found the table. Was it online? Did you do like a Google search or something? What was the? I'm trying to remember how you
Yeah,
found the.
I did a
Yeah.
Google search
Okay. You
and
Google, you Googled. You Googled. And so you find us, and you're like, okay, I'm going to go to a church. Now, you didn't really have so much of a church background, if I recall. That wasn't something you really grew up necessarily like going every Sunday or anything. So this is a pretty new experience for you. So you're gonna go to this church. Like, walk me through that experience. Where yeah, just what was that like walking through those doors for the first time?
oh man, part of me was just like, yeah, you're going to church for the first time, and the other part was like, what are you doing here? Why are we here? I was just so nervous, and I was like afraid someone would judge me or find out I'm trans or something, and it just scared me.
Yeah.
Like, oh my goodness, I'm here in God's house, and what am I doing here?
Yeah. So you named I think about judgment. Was that the language you just used? Like kind of
Mhm.
afraid, like someone's gonna judge you. So that sounds like there was just a lot of fear, um, and because you're going from being mostly alone to all of a sudden, well, church, at least, like not church online. That's a different vibe, but there in person, like it's people and all that. So, um, and I remember your first Sunday, and um, I was so proud of you because I could tell you were real scared. You seemed really nervous to be there, but you pushed through, man. Like
Yeah.
you pushed through and you did it. So kind of walk me through, the months after that. What has it meant, to you to kind of be a part of this community? And you've engaged in things like even a meetup and such. So how has all that kind of come together to help you? Kind of, or how has it helped you? I guess I'll ask it like that. How has that helped kind of shift you away from the place you were into something, kind of better? Talk me through that.
Oh, jeez. I mean, you guys have just changed my life so much. I I was even afraid to let God into my life because I just figured he was just so judgmental of people similar to me, and I know he was just only trying to help me and lead me toward a better life, and I found it with the table and all of you, and I'm just honestly so blessed that you all on the table are in my life, and I couldn't ask for a better life than this, and it just warms my heart. There are people who are accepting, and that I shouldn't be afraid to be who I am because that's what you all have taught me. And
Mm.
I just want to thank you all.
You are so very welcome, my friend. I love what you named about there at the end about feeling that kind of freedom to be yourself. That like you can be loved just right where you're at, um,
Mhm.
and that's a huge um, that's a huge insight, and not just to get intellectually, but to like get like here, what I mean, the heart, like to let that start to sink in, and yeah, that's pretty amazing. So, man, um, thank you for being a part of us, and thank you for stepping out, not only tonight to like share a little bit and kind of open up, but really that first time, to be brave, to be vulnerable, to step out like you did and push through some of that intense fear and anxiety, and then just to see on the backside, what God not just has done, but is continuing to do in your life, in your heart and your mind. It's stinking amazing. So
It is.
we're really proud of you. I've had people, other leaders, when we started the table, or people who kind of helped us start it, have told me, like, man, if we started this church community just for Adam, it would have been worth it. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. So we love you lots. Thank you for opening up and sharing. Did you have anything else you wanted to name or encourage others with before we kind of transition?
Just to be yourself, and don't be afraid to let God into your life, because He won't judge you for who you are. He loves you unconditionally.
That's perfect. Well, thank you, my friend. Appreciate you.
Appreciate you, and thank you.
Well, I love that guy. His greatness. So just to kind of close this out tonight, I wanted to kind of name that, I know there can be kind of certain, I don't know quite how to frame it, kind of stereotypes, gender, and, statements like all women should be X, or all men act like Y, or, whatever those kinds of things are, kind of generally overstatements. But there are some statistically kind of significant differences in kind of how males and females, roughly tend to be. And if you look kind of across the world, women tend to live about 6 to 8 years longer than men. And one of the reasons basically seems to be that females tend to basically open up, create better connections, have more friends, be more intentional about cultivating relationships, and just generally tend to be more vulnerable and open in sharing. And so I wanted to speak to all the folks who identify as male who can hear my voice right now. I want to encourage you, for the sake of your own spiritual, emotional, physical health, just all the reasons, for the sake of even your own children, if you have them, just the example you're setting for your family. I just want to name, we've got some work to do. And so I just want to encourage, yes, everyone, but especially those of the male persuasion listening to me right now, if you're not currently, if you don't have community, if you don't have, a group of people that you're really opening up to and sharing some of what's going on, not just in your head, but in your heart, I really want to just encourage you to join one of our meetups. That's what we call our small groups here at the table. It's a thing that Adam joined one of those, and I know it's been really huge in his life. And so, yeah, I just encourage you to get connected, and because I want this year, we've got a few more months for sure of this season we're in, and I don't want anyone at the table, a part of us, to experience a crushing loneliness in this season, when I get it. It's a weird, crazy year. And so I just encourage you, find some community. It takes, and you might say, like, well, I just want my community, I just want to form naturally and organically. Awesome. So do I. But you know what? Sometimes you just have to be intentional. I think, again, of Adam stepping out. And it didn't probably feel natural and organic for him to, step out, go to church, join a small group and all that. But he was intentional. And then out of that, God has done just such amazing, amazing things. And so I just encourage us all, as we close out this year, to move into a more communal way of being, so that the chains of loneliness in our life and our community can be broken. All right, let me pray for you. Lord Jesus, I just thank you for every person hearing my voice right now. God, you are up to something beautiful in their lives. And I pray that you would call them out of isolation, out of any fakeness or need to pretend and perform. And I call them, God, by your Spirit, into their true selves, into vulnerability, into honesty. God, do that work deep in their hearts and minds. I thank you for them. I thank you for this church community, God, all that you're up to in our lives. May you continue to take us deeper. In the powerful name of Jesus, I pray. Amen.